Hey guys, just a heads up, I'm going to go through an introduction to Hume, but right now I have two very noisy and somewhat unsettled junior classes on both sides. It's just been raining, it's period 4, they might be a bit noisy, so if you hear anything in the background or if I get distracted, you'll understand why, okay? What do we have to do now? Well, we've looked at Locke and we've tried to explore Locke's notion of personal identity, pretty much how consciousness and memory allow us to maintain a psychological continuity amongst memories, okay? Now it's time to look at what Hume says about personal identity. And in many ways it's very much a criticism of Locke, and more of a criticism of Locke's induction and inductive reasoning. We should be able to use the two to kind of have a conversation with each other and see what we think at the end of covering both of these guys. But just today we're doing an introduction to Hume. And our overall goal is we're going to build a basic level of prior knowledge that will allow us to understand Hume's readings. So we're looking for a very basic prior knowledge kind of level of understanding this time. We're not trying to build really complex, in-depth understandings of what it is that he said. Okay. So our first success criteria is the usual one. We're going to name, define, and interrelate key terms. Then after that, we're going to develop a basic understanding of Hume's empirical skepticism, which is very different from Cartesian skepticism. And then we're going to practice processing our notes using non-linguistic representations and other methods, because it is important to develop really good note-taking techniques. So I'd like you to write these 3 success criteria down and then give yourself a score out of 4, which tells me how well you can do them and how well you understand the concepts you're supposed to understand in these success criteria. Thank you. Okay, so your APK will be to draw a picture that represents something related to inductive reasoning. Now, if you forget what inductive reasoning is, I'll just give you an example. Inductive reasoning is when you take 2 seemingly unrelated events, you put them together and say there's some kind of cause and effect or some kind of link or association between them. Okay? It doesn't have to be a cause, it can be any kind of association, but inductive thinking is about generating associations between seemingly 2 independent events. So, if I see the sun rise, we know basically that the sun rising has 2 completely different events. It has the Earth's horizon and it has the sun. The sun and the Earth's horizon in no way imply the existence of each other. So there's no deductive logic that can be performed there. But as we wake up in the morning, we notice that the sun rises over the horizon. And if we make that prediction into the future, that the sun will rise tomorrow and the day after, then we've performed some kind of inductive thinking. So I would like you to draw a picture that represents something related to inductive reasoning, okay? Cheers. Okay, so let's have a look at the context of Hume. Hume was very fascinated with the empiricism of this guy called Locke. And also, he was fascinated with the empiricism of this guy called Berkeley. He was very into looking at experience and understanding how experience could account for the nature of the mind, but many other things. Okay? Which is just very similar to Locke. In fact, his writing of his major piece of work occurred 50 years after John Locke had published his major writing on what it means to be a person. Okay? He completely rejects any kind of deductive thinking, and that's why I put a little cross next to Descartes, because we know that the cogito was derived deductively, and then there were many different kinds of thinking, conclusions that Descartes arrived at that were also quite deductive. In fact, the very idea that I'm a thinking thing, these are the different aspects of the thinking thing, were pretty much derived from deduction using the process of doubt, and he completely rejects that. Now might be a good time to just record some notes and some basic understandings. Okay. In fact, according to him, you shouldn't really try and generate a philosophy that looks at any kind of deductive, idea-based thinking or tautological thinking. You should look at the sensory experience and perception and use that as a framework for building a philosophy. This was very controversial at the time because he flatly rejected the existence of a god, which about 100 years before he was born, would have basically got him killed. But at this point in time, society evolved to just make it a controversial position to say that God doesn't exist, or more importantly from his point of view, because he doubts any kind of rational type of thinking and only believes in the information from the senses and the perceptions we get from that. He only really believes there that they should be the sole focus, so you can't really justify the existence of a God, right? His major book is a treatise of human nature, and in the treatise of human nature he rejects deductive thinking, he rejects any kind of thinking about a separate world of ideas, and he tries to build a more scientific and empirical point of view about how the world and the mind and the person works. And it just so happens that if you do a lot of his reading, he's really anticipating a lot of psychological ideas that we have today. His book can be divided into 3 different sections. He talks about the nature of understanding, which is where he talks about what psychologists would call cognition today, which is the process of thinking. He talks about the nature of the passions, where he talks about free will and emotion. And he talks about morality. So the treatise on human nature is divided into 3 books, and these books are all dealing with different topics. Take some notes. Like Descartes, but very unlike Descartes, Hume was noted for being very, very sceptical. Very sceptical of ideas and grand thoughts that people tended to have. So his argument was that really the mind, or us as people when we're thinking, tends to just basically create associations between ideas or associations between perceptions, okay? And a lot of the connections we find between ideas and between perceptions can be wrong. They can be brought into question, right? So he's not really a big fan of, I should make this really clear, perception he trusts, but ideas he doesn't trust. He thinks that they can be brought into question, okay? So maybe you should take a note about that. Ideas he doesn't trust, perception he does trust, and he thinks the connections between ideas can be brought into question. Take a note. So there's my question mark there. And as a result, because our understanding of the world, which is basically these connections between ideas, because of our understanding of the world is formed by observing the world through the 5 senses and then creating ideas based on those observations, we can't really know the world for certain. We can only know it with probability. And the reason for that is because of the problem of induction. It's impossible to see every single event happen for all of time and eternity and therefore make the right conclusions. So when I say the sun rises, it's only really a probabilistic statement. And the reason why it's only really probabilistic is because I can't see every single instance of the sun rising. Okay? And because I can't see it, I can only predict based on my prior experience what's going to happen, but that prediction is only a prediction based on probability. It can't be a prediction based on certainty. So again, there you go, there's why the sun's there. We have what's called the problem of induction. We can't observe every single event, so we can't know if the ideas we link together and create based on every single instance when something has occurred. We're only based on a small sample or some kind of sample of which everything would occur. So therefore, induction is kind of flawed. There's a big issue with it, probably because we can't observe every single instance and make the right induction. And obviously our relationships between cause and effect, causation, are basically relying on induction. So causation can't really give us a completely accurate picture of what happens in the universe, because we can't observe every single event that ever happened in the universe related to that particular cause and effect relationship. So this means that our mind and the way that we understand the world through causation is deeply troubled. Take some notes. Now, despite the fact that Hume notes that there's a problem with induction, and I'll go over that problem again, the problem with induction is that you can only make statements of probability, not certainty, because you're not able to observe every single event that happened in that particular subset or set, right? Despite the fact that he identifies an issue with induction, he's deeply empirical. So he denies or totally rejects any kind of what we call rational or tautological ideas. He just wants to reflect on experience, and he just wants to generate conclusions based on those kind of experiences. Okay. So here we have the mind, and he believes that the mind. Oh, sorry, no, this isn't representing the mind. This time we're representing knowledge, because I've got lots of different declarative things that are being kept in here, right? And also procedural things. So declarative is like a fact or a piece of content, and a procedure is like a way of doing something, and the mind stores that as knowledge. And he believes that the only knowledge that is reliable is knowledge that we gain through the five senses. And any kind of perception that we have through the five senses is basically an impression, right? And then these impressions, when we're reflecting on them, allow us to generate ideas, okay? So let me give you an example. Say, for instance, I experience pain. If I have a memory of that pain, like, say, for instance, I get punched in the face, and I have a memory of what it felt like to be punched in the face, that would be an immediate impression. It's something directly related to my sensory experience. But then I reflect again on what it felt like, or other things related to that impression. It becomes an idea, i.e., I've been punched in the face, this is what it felt like, this is the impression. Oh, that's similar to other things that have occurred to me, i.e. that, oh, this is what pain is, when I make those connections and I do those reflections. Take a note. Now, again, so here we go. Here's what I said before. He says perceptions can create two different things. They can create ideas and they can create impressions. And ideas are merely reflections on what the senses have put together, right? And basically they're also the ability to tie together these different reflections. So a unicorn is an imaginary concept and an imaginary idea. The reason why we have it is because the idea combines two perceptions or ideas from perceptions that we've already formed. We've seen horns and we've seen a horse. And therefore, while reflecting on the horn and reflecting on the horse, we gave it a name and we tried to turn it into an idea or concept. Then we tied them together and created an association. And when we did that, we generated the unicorn. So ideas can be reflections on our immediate experiences or sensations or impressions, which is the language we want to use. And they can also be the tying together of other ideas. But he argues that because there's a lot of mental work, these ideas are really shadows of impressions. They're not as strong or reliable. In fact, they're a bit weaker, okay? Because the mind could make errors in forming associations. Take a note. But impressions, on the other hand, are much more immediate and much more there, and they're hard to fake. So if the senses can provide you with really immediate and awesome information, then basically that information is going to be much less polluted by the wrong associations formed in the mind. In fact, impressions, because they end up being immediate memories of direct sensory experience, are very strong because there's hardly any room for processing error. Okay? Take a note. I mentioned before that ideas are two things. Ideas can be they can be the reflection we have on an impression, or they can be the tying together and the links or ideas that result of the links of tying other ideas together, okay? And in many senses, when we go on and we go to read what Hume has to say, a lot of these are not logical. And the ones that he says are not logical are causation, resemblance, contiguity, and there was one more we'll look at that later. All right, we'll just go through those three. Contiguity isn't really much of an issue. He doesn't really talk about that much when we're looking at personal identity. But if you want to know what contiguity is, it's basically when you can find some kind of general link between two things. A classic example would be what we call a metonym. A metonym is like a metaphor, but it's a lot closer. It's where the two things being compared are really close. So let me give you an example of government as a metaphor. All right, I might want to say that the government of Australia is like something that's really, really divorced. Yeah, it would be a metaphor to say that the government of Australia is like a mum and dad in a family, and we can see the metaphor there. I mean, it's a simile, the way I phrase it. We can say mum and dad of the family. And the reason for that is because we both know that usually the things that mums and dads are in charge are kind of similar and very like what governments would be in charge of in a country, managing finances, providing services, maintaining welfare, that kind of thing. But when we call Canberra government, and we hear this a lot in the news, we're in Canberra right now, but they don't actually mean the city. They mean the government, the federal government. That's where they are. That's what they're looking at. That's a relationship of contiguity, right? Now, in this case, Canberra is not really a metaphor, but it's a place that's so closely associated with Canberra. Canberra is so closely associated with Federal Government House that people regularly interchange the two, all right? And because of that really close association, we say that's a relationship of contiguity. But he's mainly concerned with looking at the errors we draw when we're looking at relationships of resemblance and relationships of causation. Take a note. Okay. Causation is pretty much the one that he says is the most dangerous, and this is why. He likes to conclude that the soul is not a substance, right? And if the soul is a substance, then... And because he says the soul is not a substance, he kind of completely rejects the soul. And we don't need to understand why he's saying that at the moment. We just need to know that's what he said, okay? And he also goes on to say, if we need to define what a substance is, he's basically going to say a substance is a separate thing, and therefore our perceptions are pretty much substances, which is really important. And if this is the case, then we don't need some kind of physical or substance-based place that the person resolves in, because we can start looking at perceptions as the place where the idea of a person is, okay? And that is really, really important. Personhood is highly tied to perception. So take some notes. Alright, so it's okay if you didn't completely get everything. This was just building some prior knowledge, and the deeper links come along later. But just remember, the first thing we looked at was the context, and basically we look at a context where he loves the inductive reasoning of these two philosophers, that's Locke and Berkeley. And inductive reasoning, again, is where we make associations between two events or two different objects that are independent of each other. He rejects the rational or tautological or deductive thinking of people like Descartes, and believes that the senses are the only way that we can completely have reliable information about anything. And this put him at odds with the idea that God exists, because it just couldn't be proved. And that was very controversial at that time. And in an attempt to fit with this kind of empirical thinking, he wanted to develop a more scientific, psychologically based account of personhood and the mind, okay? Now, Hume is known very much for a very different kind of skepticism, and that skepticism is tied to the problem of induction. The mind sees two ideas, or the mind can see two different perceptions, but mainly we're looking at ideas and can make ties together. The problem is that when they tie these things together, they can often get it wrong. So the associations generated between two ideas are up to a subjective mind that can get it wrong. They can be called into doubt. So the only thing that's really reliable is sensory data, but you can't sense everything, which means that any kind of predictions you make based on sensory data or in future impressions are highly probabilistic. You can't know anything for certain. You might see the sun rise every morning for all of your life, but that doesn't mean it's going to rise tomorrow, though it's highly probable that it does. Okay? This is what we call the problem of induction. The problem of induction is the fact that you can't observe every single case of the relationship between the sun rising on the horizon, and because you can't do that, you don't know for certain that the relationship or the cause and effect relationship or whatever relationship you've postulated is going to be true throughout all of the history of the universe. Okay? Going over here, again, we look at knowledge, and the most reliable form of knowledge, according to Hume, is based on the senses, not ideas, right? And here he says basically the same thing. Because it's immediate and easy to trust, you should rely on information based on the senses. And when you do this, you form what's called an impression. An impression is kind of a memory of something that you sensed. Ideas, however, are reflections on those impressions, okay? You think about what actually happened to you, and you might tie it together with other things that happened to you or other ideas, and in the process you generate new ideas. So ideas are the result of associations between impressions between other ideas. And one example of that is a unicorn. We've all seen a horse, we've all seen a horn, we have impressions of them, we have ideas of them, put them together, and bang, you get the concept of a unicorn. But these can be produced with a lot of error, and they're very weak. Alright, which is made out here. And when we look at the three different forms of weak associations generated by the mind, we've got contiguity, resemblance, and we've got causation. Causation is very dangerous because later on we're going to see how it's being used to justify the existence of the soul, and he believes you shouldn't be able to do that. He argues that you don't need the soul, and if the soul is a completely separate thing, then anything that is a substance must also be a completely separate thing, and every perception is distinct and unique. Therefore, distinctions, these perceptions are really important, and they're the basis of personhood. And we don't need a physical thing like the brain or body, or even a non-physical thing like the soul, to identify and be the seat of personhood. Alrighty, so let's go back to our goals. Alright, right now you should be able to say, if this come up, let's put some pause until it does. Okay, so you should be easily able to see that through our concept map we have been able to generate a lot of interrelated key terms, and we've been able to trace how these key terms have led to different conclusions, okay? You should easily be able to say, I know what empirical skepticism is. If you don't need to watch this video again, you need to talk to me about it, alright? Again, if you don't have any idea of what Hume's empirical skepticism is, talk to me about it. I can't repeat it enough, okay? And you should, while taking notes, have had some kind of picture, some kind of visual representation of those notes, because doing so allows you to have more psychological ins that can help you remember the content, okay? It's just a really good way of making the content metaphorical as well. So you have another way of accessing the content, but it's also really a good way of just having other visual reference in order to understand the content. So please make sure that you've done that. Cheers. Thank you.